US Ukraine. US Ukraine. Good morning, good day, or good evening. We welcome everybody to this special webinar with a very special guest, George Weigel. George Weigel is one of the most, I think, critical thinkers that we have in this town, in Washington and beyond. And well, let me first give you his biography. Currently, of course, he's at the Center for Public Policy, and he has served on numerous organizations. He also had founded the James Madison Foundation that he was president of from 1987 to 89. He's the each summer, he and several other Catholic intellectuals from the United States go to Poland and have students from across Europe conduct the Tertio Millennial Seminar on the Free Society in Krakow, and where they have assortments of students from all over, including come from Ukraine. He's on the advisory council of the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation, and he has written a plethora of books. I don't know, George, how many? I've lost count. I would call George an intellectual, and that's kind of an interesting word, and I actually looked it up. What does it mean to be an intellectual? Well, it's the definition is that it's someone who does critical thinking, does research and reflection about the reality of society, and proposes solutions for the normative problems of society. There aren't very many of these people around. And frankly, George, when I first invited you to speak and you so graciously accepted, I was thinking, well, who could I invite that I would consider sort of to be, I guess, on your level of intellectual prowess? I couldn't think of very many or any. And actually, one of the things that I read about how can you tell if somebody's a real intellectual is to look about the people that he surrounds himself with. Well, perhaps I'm not fully aware of all the people that are in your intellectual circle, but I decided to go ahead and be the one to visit with you and talk with you, because I think I am perhaps a person who has been a witness to and can attest to the incredible role that you have played in so many issues, but certainly on the moral issues and mentions of religion, religion in the former Soviet Union, and especially in Ukraine, whether it's with the Ukrainian Catholic Church. So I welcome you and thank you so much. You wrote 2 fantastic articles, and that was really the reason I really reached out for you at this time. And one of them was, of course, the Russian Orthodox Church in Ukraine and how Putin is using the baptism of Rus as the false pretext for Russian imperialism. And then the other one, a very important one, was Russia, Ukraine, and moral reckoning. So George, thank you for that and for all the work you've done for many, many decades. Over to you, George.
Thanks, Nadia. It's great to be here. I'm sorry we're here under such difficult circumstances for our friends in Ukraine. To get the conversation going, let me make 4 or 5 points briefly. The first point is that while we all talk about the Ukraine crisis, it's important to recognize from the get-go that this is a Russian-created crisis. Russia created this crisis, not Ukraine, not the United States, and not NATO. Ukraine is not a threat to Russia in terms of Russia's national security concerns. The United States is not a threat to Russia in terms of Russia's national security concerns. And NATO is no more a threat to Russia than it is to Botswana. These alleged threats are simply part of a propaganda campaign engineered by the Kremlin to do what? Well, this gets us to the second point. This artificially created crisis, which, by the way, has been going on since 2014. This is not simply a matter of Russian troop movements toward the Ukrainian border in recent months. It's a matter of an ongoing Russian aggression within Ukraine that comes in various parts, which we'll discuss in a moment. This artificially created crisis is part of a larger strategy of Mr. Putin to reverse the verdict of the Cold War. Let's remember what Putin has said about the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, that this was the greatest geopolitical disaster of the 20th century. Well, when you describe the dismantling of a prison house of nations maintained for 70 years by brute force, terror, and murder as the greatest geopolitical disaster of the 20th century, you're telling us something about yourself. What has become even more clear in recent weeks is that Putin's attempt to reverse the verdict of the Cold War is now being carried out in league with Xi Jinping's China. The joint statement by Mr. Putin and Mr. Xi right before the Olympics flatly said that we intend to redo world politics according to our preferences. The days of the Western-led, democratically oriented world political scene are over. We are moving in. That was about as obvious a statement of intent as you're going to get in world politics today. The third point I want to begin with is one that you mentioned briefly. Putin's aggression is underwritten by a false rendition of history, including the Christian history of the Eastern Slavic peoples. Putin's claim that Ukraine is not a real nation, which he would, of course, repeat with reference to Belarus, is rooted in a false telling of the story of Russian history, as if Russia were the sole legitimate heir to the baptism of the Eastern Slavic peoples in 988 AD. Now, as I pointed out in that Wall Street Journal piece that you referenced, that baptism of Rus, or as I prefer to say, the baptism of the Eastern Slavic peoples, took place in Kiev, in what is now the capital of Ukraine. And at that point, Moscow was a dense forest populated by wild animals, and remained so for the next 200 years. So to claim that Russia has a monopoly on that history, that Russia is the sole owner of that religious and cultural history, is a lie. It's a historical falsehood, and false historical storylines or narratives, to use that awful word, always lead to trouble. That this false rendition of history, or distorted rendition of history, is being supported by the present leadership of the Russian Orthodox Church is simply shameful. There's a long history there too that we can get into later if you like, but I will simply flag the fact that when putatively Christian leaders support a murderous tyrant in the name of a false view of history, something is seriously awry. My fourth point would be that Putin's aggression against Ukraine, now highlighted by the presence of these more than 100,000 troops on the Ukrainian border, has been carried out for the past 7 or 8 years by means of aggression that we're not quite used to. It's being carried out by the big lie. One of those we've already mentioned, that Ukraine and NATO and the United States pose a security threat to Russia. That is rubbish. The big lie that Putin exemplifies a superior form of democracy is rubbish. And yet the Russian state, presiding over a decrepit economy, which has a per capita income, a per capita GNP, half that of Lithuania, nonetheless spends billions of dollars every year perpetrating these big lies throughout the world through instruments like the television network RT, through trolls and bots that flood the internet and social media with nonsense. This is something we're not used to dealing with, and we're going to have to figure out a way to counter. This aggression is carried out by various forms of hybrid warfare. I've mentioned the disinformation campaign. Well, this is now getting nastier and nastier. As you and I were discussing before the webinar began, there have been hundreds of false bomb threats raised at Ukrainian schools in the last few months. What kind of people deliberately scare children in order to create social chaos in a country? Yet that's what we're dealing with. My fifth point simply, and I'll wind up on this, is that all of this must be resisted on both strategic and moral grounds. The world is not going to be a better place if Putin and Xi Jinping are in charge rather than the West. The West makes all sorts of mistakes. We could sit here for the rest of the webinar discussing all of the mistakes the West has made and the corruptions of Western culture today. That's not the point. The point is that the West has a capacity for self-correction and tyrannies do not. So it is imperative for the future of peace and freedom, stability, prosperity in the world, that this attempt by two thugs to reverse the verdict of history in the Cold War be resisted. It's also imperative that this be resisted on moral grounds. Our friends, people who look to us for assistance, are counting on us for that assistance. I think they've been reassured. I hope they've been reassured by the firmer stance taken by the West over the past several weeks with respect to Ukraine, but we need to beef that up. We need to, for example, pour economic aid into Ukraine so that Putin's efforts to disrupt the Ukrainian economy, cause a crisis of confidence in the Ukrainian state, are rebuffed. Military assistance is crucial, but economic assistance could be just as crucial in maintaining Ukraine's own resistance to this Russian aggression. So those are 5 points that I think give us something to talk about going forward here.
George, thank you so very much for your actual really deep understanding both of the history and what it means for today. Before I go sort of onto some of these contemporary, I guess, questions, I just want to go back a little bit to when we first met in 1988, when I was involved with the Millennium commemoration of the Millennium of Christianity of Kiev Rus, and here in Washington. And we were basically fighting a hybrid war about, whose millennium was it, and, various things that were going on. And I recall when we met that you had put together a critical document that we really relied on, that was to help us, if you say, make our case about what was going on with the Ukrainian Catholic and Orthodox churches in Ukraine. And it was, this was when you were president of the James Madison Foundation, right? And thank you for sending that to me. I had not looked at it since 1988, and I did so a few days ago. And I was, again, really not impressed, but really grateful to what you had done then. This was, and I think we have the cover of the appeal. Oksana, can we just share a screen? We've posted this appeal on our website. It's an incredible document. And there you have the actual appeal. It's in English, I guess, in Russian and Ukrainian. But then to see the signatures that you had gotten, and if we could flip to the next couple of slides, there were hundreds. I don't know, I didn't actually have the heart yet to ask one of our interns to count the number of signatories. Oksana, can we flip to those pages about with the signatories? But throughout the country, religious leaders, civic leaders, intellectuals, that was an incredible effort. George, why and how did you get interested in doing this? And it's just, to me, an incredible feat of what you did with that appeal. And I really do think that people who are interested and supportive of Ukraine should look at it and appreciate what it was for the time it was, and really how important it was for this ongoing struggle about the historical, what's right about the baptism of Kiev Rus. So, George, how did you get to that?
Well, really, it all starts actually almost 10 years before that, when I became deeply involved in human rights issues behind the Iron Curtain. The specific acceleration of this came in 1984-85. I was spending a sabbatical year at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, then housed in the Smithsonian Castle. One of my fellows was the premier historian of the underground Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church, Dr. Bogdan Bosirkiw. We became close friends during that year. I got a year-long tutorial in the complicated religious history of Ukraine. And 3 years later, when it became clear that the leadership of the Russian Orthodox Church was attempting to own the millennium of Christianity among Eastern Slavs, lock, stock, and barrel, with no attention to Ukraine or Belarus or anybody else, I just thought something ought to be done about this. So working with various colleagues around the country, we formulated this very detailed appeal for religious freedom in what was then the Soviet Union. Dr. Bosirkiw helped me with this. Nobody knew Soviet federal religious law or Soviet Republic law better than he did. Jim Billington, then at the Library of Congress, helped me with it as well. And then we rounded up signatures, as you say, from an awful lot of people. And I had the pleasure of presenting this to President Reagan in the Oval Office early in 1988. I think the booklet I sent you has a letter to me from President Reagan in the back of it. And the themes from that appeal seem to have worked their way into President Reagan's address at the Danilov Monastery in Moscow later in 1988. So that's my personal history with this. Of course, in the course of all this, I had also met our mutual friend and a doctoral student at Harvard, Boris Gudziak, who's now the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Archbishop of Philadelphia. So this has been part of my life for really 37 years now. And it's been an honor, frankly, to be engaged with this world of Eastern Christianity. It's something that Western Christians know far too little about, whether that's Latin Rite Catholics or Protestants. So I've been happy to be something of a transmission belt between the various forms of Ukrainian Christian community and the church in the West.
Well, George, something more than a transition belt. Your unique opportunity to get into this issue when you did, you said, but then also, of course, your personal relationship, being the authorized biographer of St. John Paul II, which of course also kind of fed into this overall issue of what was going on in the Soviet Union, right, and with the Russian Orthodox Church.
Well, my relationship with John Paul II goes back to the early 90s. My personal relationship with him, let me just clear up one enduring myth about John Paul II and me. Witness to Hope and The End and the Beginning are not an authorized biography. An authorized biography is one in which the subject gets to vet the product. John Paul II did not see Witness to Hope, a word of it, until I handed it to him at Castel Gandolfo in September 1999. So it was my idea to do this. He agreed to cooperate. And of course, that deepened my understanding of this complex and fascinating, often tumultuous, sometimes a bit unpleasant, religious history in Poland, Ukraine, the Baltic states, Russia, what is now Belarus, etc. But I think his affection for Eastern Christianity had a deep influence on me. John Paul II knew exactly what the leadership of Russian Orthodoxy was up to, namely that they were owned by the state. But he also had a deep respect for the ancient spiritual traditions of the Russian church. I think his own thinking was quite influenced by some Russian Orthodox thinkers, one of whom, Vladimir Soloviev, eventually became a Catholic. He knew that world very, very well. And as he often said, Christianity, Catholicism needed to breathe again with both of its lungs, its Western lung and its Eastern lung. So all of that surely had an influence on me.
Again, thank you so much. You're such you've been a gift to those of us that have been also engaged in this struggle for decades or most of our lives. You know, George, in your article, you also in your remarks lament the fact that the Russian Orthodox Church is not providing, the moral influence that you would expect, I guess, a church to provide. Do you see other parts of Russian society perhaps taking that mantle? For instance, the recent letter, I think it was open appeal that was signed over, was it 100 individuals who bravely, put their name down, right? From all walks of life. And certainly the recent appeal from the current retired Leonard Ivaskov, who's chairman of the All Russian Officers Assembly, who I understand reading, well, Anders Osland wrote an article that this was somebody, this is not just anybody. This is somebody who was considered a hardliner in the 90s. So his statement carries more weight than it seems that we in the West are even understanding or looking at. Will these kinds of actions take that moral mantle within society?
Nadia, I think it's important to distinguish, first of all, between the leadership of the Russian Orthodox Church, Patriarch Kirill, Metropolitan Hilarion, their chief ecumenical and so-called foreign affairs officer, and the ordinary clergy and people of Russian Orthodoxy. My understanding is that there is something of a revival of authentic Orthodox faith out in the countryside. Russia is not just Moscow and St. Petersburg. There's no question in anybody's mind, or there shouldn't be, that the leadership of the church functions as an extension of the Kremlin. But the ordinary people of the church may have a very different view, and I think we have to hope that that's the case. Part of the Putin game here, I have long thought, is that he's running a crumbling society with the economic situation I described a moment ago, half the per capita GNP of Lithuania, huge public health problems, totally botched response to COVID, vast alcoholism problems. My friend, the demographer Nick Eberstadt, told me some years ago, I think this is 2015, this may have changed a bit, but in 2015, the average 15-year-old Haitian boy in Haiti who was 15 years old in 2015 had a longer life expectancy than a 15-year-old boy in Russia. I mean, that's just appalling and a human tragedy of the first order. Now, this guy's been in charge for over 20 years. He has to keep moving forward in some way to maintain whatever authority he has. So I think this attempt to reconstitute the old Soviet sphere of influence is part of that process. Now, there's clearly resistance to that. The two instances you mentioned are not without importance. It was not an accident, as Marxists used to say, that after the invasion of Eastern Ukraine, the so-called Donbass region, in 2014, there was no public recognition in Russia of Russian military casualties. These body bags were coming back and these young men were being buried anonymously. This is not good for the stability of that regime. Now, he obviously understands that he's got regime stability problems and is therefore making common cause with his friend in Beijing. I think it's quite disturbing that somebody like Hungary's Viktor Orban seems to be taking a sympathetic view of Putin's situation. And I think Mr. Orban needs to be told by the elders in NATO that this is not how a NATO ally behaves. Orban's press conference with Putin a couple of weeks ago was really appalling. I mean, Putin just lied, one big lie after another, and Orban stood there without correcting it, including on the fact that NATO poses some sort of a threat to Russia, which, as I said, is just farcical. NATO poses no more of a threat to Russia than it does to Papua New Guinea. And Viktor Orban should have said that, perhaps a little more elegantly than I just did, but he should have said that. So Putin is not completely omnipowerful. And he's got himself in something of a crack now. He has to have something to show for all of this. And let's hope that President Macron of France and others don't give him something, because he really doesn't deserve anything at this point.
So when people like Orban, is it that he didn't stand up to him? Does he not know or remember history?
I think part of this is, frankly, a lack of confidence in the United States. I mean, we have not been showing ourselves very vigilant with respect to Putin for 20 years. So there may be a lack of confidence in the US there. The notion that Putin is modeling, or Xi Jinping is modeling, some superior form of 21st century society may have something to do with this as well. Now, this is, again, complete rubbish for all of the factors I just listed. Perhaps most rubbishy or most offensive is the notion that Putin is some kind of defender of traditional Christian values. It is not a traditional Christian value to murder your opponents at home or in London. I think Boris Nemtsov would find the notion of Putin, Christian leader, as completely ridiculous. Mr. Navalny undoubtedly would find that completely ridiculous. But it tracks with a certain, I find, disturbing trend in conservative thought throughout the West, that because Western culture is such a mess, therefore we have to imitate authoritarian regimes. That is not the answer to the cultural distress of the West right now.
George,
that's an argument for a whole nother day. But
but it's a point. It really is one of the questions I wanted to put forth. In 1988, of course, you saw it early, sort of the oncoming propaganda war about, the history of Kiev and Rus, right, the baptism. At that time, it seemed that we were concerned in fighting with the liberal establishment who were, I used to explain Russian influence in the US in the academic world and the cultural sphere, the Bolshoi, the Fabergé eggs. During the millennium, I remember Senator, I think it was Rockefeller, returning an icon. I mean, those were the people that were sort of enamored with, were supported by. But now we've seen a really movement, and I think we saw it coming, about the infiltration of what you would call conservative organizations, like I think we read about, NRA, and you mentioned, that part of the evangelical maybe world sees, the defender of, Christian values. And then, people like, say, you already mentioned in conservative circles, let's say on Fox News. I mean, one of the people that signed your appeal was Charles Krauthammer. I would love to channel him as to what he would say about what's going on.
Yeah, Charles would not be at all pleased, I'm sure, with some of what's being said on Fox News. I pay no attention to that, frankly. It's so painfully ill-informed and so deeply ideological that people can't see the reality in front of their face. I don't think one has to go to conspiracy theories about, whose money is behind what, to recognize ideological drunkenness or ideological besottedness, for what it is. What is ideology? Ideology is the deformation of reality for the sake of political conviction or advantage. If you really believe that the last 20 years of US foreign policy have been a complete disaster, which I do not believe, then you're going to take this neo-isolationist position, which is very, very similar to what was being said in this country by the old America First isolationists of the 1920s and the 1930s. I just read a very interesting new book called Hitler's American Gamble. People forget that after Pearl Harbor, the immediate US declaration of war on December 8th was only against Japan. Franklin Roosevelt had a problem here. Even after Pearl Harbor, even after the fact that there had been a de facto shooting war in the Atlantic between the US Navy and the German U-boats for months at that point, there were still American isolationists after Pearl Harbor who were saying, Hitler's not the problem, we'll fight the Japanese, but let's not get sucked into Europe. Now, Hitler solved that problem for Roosevelt by declaring war on us on December 11th, 1941, at which point American isolationism simply imploded. But these Fox people, some of them, and others, it's not just Fox, remind me of those 1930s isolationists. They've got a fixed cast of mind. We always make a mess when we get involved in the world. In the 1920s and 30s, it was dissatisfaction with the results of the First World War, theories about merchants of death getting us into the First World War and so forth, that they're so besotted by these ideas that they can't see what's in front of their face. That when, in this case, Putin conducts a hybrid war for 8 years in Ukraine and then moves 125,000 troops to the Ukrainian border, something is up here that has to be responded to, especially since he and Xi Jinping just said what they're up to. They're up to replacing the Western-led security order in the 21st century world. That is not something that anybody should want to see happen. And the notion that we can simply withdraw from the world, tend our own garden, fix innumerable problems that we undoubtedly have here, and be left alone is simply farcical. They are not going to leave us alone because they have every intention of becoming the hegemons of the world. And that does not include leaving us alone.
You know, George, you said you don't watch, and certainly I stopped watching a lot of this, but it's kind of hard to ignore when, you know, people are writing and asking you, you know, sort of, you know, well, what are you going to do about, you know, what is being said? And of course, I, you know, can't even bear to listen to what is being said. How do we challenge this without having to sit through and listen to it?
Well, I think people, you mentioned my seminar in Krakow, which we were able to do last summer after being COVIDed out in 2020. I was very struck last summer by the degree to which these very impressive young people are almost completely dependent on the internet and social media for information. And towards the end of the seminar, I said, you know, chastity comes in many forms. And one form of chastity is social media and internet chastity. You don't have to watch and read everything. You don't have to be constantly alert to the Twitterverse. Twitter is an inherently demagogic instrument. It does not contribute to any serious conversation about anything. And people who spend their lives tweeting are wasting their lives. I might say that that includes a former president of the United States as well, who gave a very bad example on this. People have got to learn how to distinguish.
An illegal attempt to secure a UN resolution for war, which would have given Blair perfect cover for the bloody mess that we're in now.
Well, she should have kept her mouth shut.
I'm not sure where all that's coming from. Sounds like we're refighting Iraq. But in any event, I do think one of the real challenges for serious people in democratic societies today is to learn how to distinguish real information from disinformation and frankly hysteria mongering, and get off Twitter. Just leave. And that's my prescription.
Oh, a major topic for another time, perhaps. Okay, let me not continue to monopolize the Q&A section and go to some questions that we have coming in. As a moral leader, where is Pope Francis on this ongoing Russian aggression?
I've been a bit disappointed over the last 8 years that the Vatican has not used the words war and aggression in respect of what Russia has been doing to and in Ukraine. Pope recently called for an international day of prayer for peace in Ukraine. I think that was much appreciated in Ukraine itself. The head of the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church, Major Archbishop Shevchuk, expressed great gratitude for that. I don't think the Holy See, the Vatican, has a lot of throw weight in this, frankly, right now. But the Pope calling for that World Day of Prayer for peace in Ukraine was certainly a positive step.
We can pray for more. Okay, somebody's recommending that voiding all Russian visas in US, Canada, and Europe would leave Russia, would have Russia leaving Ukraine, I guess. Is this a more effective way to counter Putin's actions than military action?
I think I have no idea how many Russians are here on visas. The really serious weapon to be used in this business right now, it seems to me, is to tell Russia that if it, as Boris Johnson put it in the Washington Post or the Wall Street Journal this morning, if the toe cap on the boot of one Russian soldier crosses the Ukrainian border, they are going to be out of the SWIFT system, the international banking, electronic banking system. That would absolutely paralyze the oligarchs of Russia, of whom Mr. Putin is one. It would be, I think, probably the most devastating economic sanction that could be laid on, even more so than canceling Nord Stream 2. To cut Russia out of the capacity to move money around the world is about as strong a sanction as you can get. And that ought to be on the table, in my view. Probably should have been on the table after the annexation of Crimea. There's one other point, Nadia, let me just make here, because I always forget it for some reason. And it's something to these nitwits who say that this is none of our business. After the crack up of the Soviet Union, there were a lot of nuclear weapons in Ukraine. Ukraine gave up those nuclear weapons. It did so under the understanding, with a treaty signed by, among others, Russia, that its borders would be respected. Now, here's a country that voluntarily disarmed itself of nuclear weapons with what it assumed was an international legal guarantee of the security of its borders. If that guarantee is not enforced, what hope is there of dealing with other nuclear powers down the line? That's both a strategic and a moral issue, it seems to me.
Yes, and one that doesn't seem to get much public discourse about the implications, and also lack of understanding about the current battlefield, in Ukraine, is as important as any in terms of even our concerns about China. I mean, it's that's also what I find a little bit perplexing. I want to circle
That is
back.
absolutely true. Let me just flag that. That's an excellent point. If Putin is allowed to saw off or effectively saw off a big chunk of Ukraine, Taiwan has had it. That will be the end of the first Chinese democracy in 5,000 years of Chinese civilization, because the world will have said, we don't care if democratic states are invaded and subjugated by tyrannies. So no, the implications of this all over the world are quite dramatic, but specifically for our friends in Taiwan, who must be extremely nervous right now, and rightly so.
George, I want to circle back to something that we discussed earlier about what's going on. The invasion of Ukraine is ongoing,
right,
in different ways. And so, this false narrative about if, Putin invades, well, let's define that. And you just made the point, I guess, what Boris Johnson said, that if one, what did we call it, boot or whatever enters Ukraine, this would be a game changer if Putin overtly, right, invades, because, he's still denying. And we're allowing him to deny that, they're not in the Donbass, right? There's just soldiers who are on vacation, I guess. So reality shows, right, about how to fight a war, go to the Donbass for your vacation in Crimea. So this is, I think, really also a conundrum for us to define what is an invasion, right? Sure. And if we're going to have these sanctions and reactions, when are they going to be triggered? And so maybe this also goes to the point that we should be doing things beforehand, right, as opposed to waiting to be reacting. But do you think that he would then take this overt step of direct military invasion?
I don't know. I do think the notion that he would invade because he's angry at sanctions is exactly backwards. These kinds of tyrants only respond to force majeure. They respond to pushback. They do not respond to weakness. And that is why it is imperative to maintain the unity of NATO in the face of this. I assume that behind the scenes, I hope that behind the scenes, this swift option has been put before the Russians. We will cut you off from the international financial system in some fashion. But as you suggest, Nadia, even if this were to cool off in the next few weeks, and we have no reason to think that that's the case, although we can hope, even if it were to cool off, you'd still have an invasion. I mean, you'd still have Ukraine, parts of Ukraine occupied by Russian forces of one sort or another. You would still have the Crimea annexation. completely illegal, you would still have a real problem here. So this is going to require fixing this over time is going to require the West keeping its eye on the ball for 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, however long it takes, to stabilize a democratic and prosperous Ukraine, which, among other things, may help accelerate some process of reform in Russia. This is part of Putin's fear, of course, is that a successful Ukraine threatens his claim that only his way of doing business will work in Russia. If a neighboring Slavic country falsifies that by its political and economic success, then his claims look pretty shaky. So that's part of the package here as well.
And that's what I think a lot of our colleagues who are so defending Putin don't understand or refuse to see that aggression against Ukraine is coupled with deeper repression within Ukraine, right? And so
repression within Russia, yeah.
I'm sorry, yes, within Russia. Yes, I misspoke. So and you started talking about human rights. This is where you began your journey, I guess, in terms of getting involved with Ukraine. The human rights abuses that are going on today in Crimea and Eastern Ukraine, no one is talking about those.
Yeah.
That are being committed right now.
Well, and nobody's talking about this low-grade war that's going on there. I mean, there have been over 10,000 deaths in this in the past 6 or 7 years. One of my Ukrainian Greek Catholic friends, Bishop Stepan Sus, who, when he was ordained a bishop a few years ago, was the youngest Catholic bishop in the world, has conducted 134 funerals of Ukrainian soldiers since 2014. I mean, that's a huge burden that I don't think any other Catholic bishop in the world is carrying right now. And yet, as we've seen some of the reporting over the last week and a half, even typically cynical American reporters are very impressed by the solidifying sense of Ukrainian nationality throughout the country, the determination to resist this aggression, and on the flip side of that, the increasing aggravation, even among Russian speakers in Ukraine with Putin, including within the Ukrainian army. So this is the sign, it seems to me, of a troubled but determined young democracy trying to work out its future in a way that we should find both impressive and worthy of our support. What's going on there, what has been going on since the Maidan Revolution of Dignity in 2013, 2014, is something that demands respect. It demands respect from anyone who believes that world politics is not simply a jungle, but is an arena of moral responsibility.
And also, it's not just a chess game between powers. I mean, we've got, human lives are deeply are at stake. So, George, you're talking about respecting, what's going on with the Ukrainian people of Ukraine. Some of us who, been watching this for 30 some years, saw the seeds of this growing civil society way back even before independence. There are times when the Kremlin oversteps, right? And gives us gifts, I call them, right? And certainly in 1988, when we had a resolution in Congress that got stalled, because we were talking about, nobody going, U.S. official going for the millennium unless the Ukrainian Catholic Orthodox churches were legalized. And it got stuck in the subcommittee, Lee Hamilton in the House. And I don't know what the forces were at work or who all, but I know we were asked to, don't reference the Catholic Church, just talk about general, religious prosecution. And we said, if we can't mention the Ukrainian Catholic churches in a millennium, when will we be able to say something? And we said, no, we just rather not have any resolution than have something that meant nothing. And so we thought that was at the end of it. But lo and behold, the head of the Ukrainian Socialist Republic, Valentina Shevchenko, wrote this letter to Congress denouncing us as fascists, liars, just ripping us. Well, of course, that just was proof positive that perhaps this was important and we should do it. And Chairman Hamilton took it to the floor and it passed with, unanimous consent. And so we also see some of this, Putin has done more to bring the people of Ukraine together than any Ukrainian presidents. But one of the things that are now seeing also that the press is now in Ukraine, right? They're not reporting about Ukraine from Moscow, which we've always had. And so even the recent articles about what's going on in Kharkiv, right? That here everybody's thinking Kharkiv is ready to become the new capital of a Russian Ukraine, right? And there's
exactly the opposite.
Exactly. And so finally, maybe the media people are actually seeing this resolve and this unity, and so penetrating this canard about Russian speakers, and most of the people on the front are Russian speakers, right? So it's maybe the truth will set everybody free at one point. So there's, I guess, these glimmers of hope. On the sanctions or the ways to prevent, do you find some of the recent discussions, even like in the UK, about being concerned about, I think one of the members of parliament wrote about the other invasion of England, and that's the business of all these elites being on the payroll in one way or another, right? So is there a movement to recognize that more?
There's no question that the Putin regime has been spreading money all over the world. I don't know that that's as determinative of policy as people sometimes think it is. There's an enormous amount of Russian investment in London, as you know, but present British government seems quite clear that we're at an inflection point here with Russia, and as I say, the cutoff of Russia from the SWIFT system would be the most devastating economic blow that we could strike. I mean, Russia is a kleptocracy. I mean, this is a government of thieves. Putin may be the wealthiest man in the world. Putin may be the wealthiest man in the world. He's got lots of cronies around him. We've got lots of money too. Cutting them off from the ability to move funds around the world would get their attention, to be sure. Now, whether we could get agreement on that, I have no idea. But that's the mega weapon in terms of sanctions, it seems to me. But on the other side of sanctions, we're getting close to the end here. Let me just say again, we need to be pouring economic assistance into Ukraine. If part of the Putin game is to destabilize the Ukrainian economy, collapse the currency, and therefore create a crisis for the present Ukrainian government, we got to do everything we can to make sure that doesn't happen.
Do you have any specific ideas on this?
I'll leave that to the economists in the conversation. But what I'm suggesting, Nadia, is that military assistance is not the only form of assistance that's needed right now. Thank you. This has been
Well, George,
good to do.
thank you so very, very much. I'm sure that our audience has gotten a greater appreciation of the work that you have done and are doing, and what a great friend you are of the people of Ukraine.
Well,
So-
they're an inspiration to me and to many others. So let's keep the conversation going. And thank you for all that the U.S. Ukraine Foundation does.
Thank you, George. Till the next.
Bye-bye now.
Bye-bye.
US Ukraine. US Ukraine.